Welcome to this special episode of the Toronto Real Estate Podcast, where we explore the overlap of city living and mental health with Dr. Mary Preisman. As an esteemed figure in psychiatry focusing on the complexities of mental health, Dr. Mary Preisman brings her extensive experience to our discussion today. We explore the pressing mental health issues amplified by Toronto's urban challenges, including the housing crisis, the aftermath of COVID-19, and the unique pressures on various population segments. Join us for a thought-provoking and overdue conversation on this platform. And please don't forget to subscribe, like, or comment. Dr. Mary Preisman holds the position of assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Department of Psychiatry. In her role at Mount Sinai Hospital, Dr. Preisman serves as a consultation liaison psychiatrist with a specialized focus in the fields of critical care psychiatry and inpatient perinatal psychiatry. Her commitment to medical education is evident through her leadership as the course director for the University of Toronto's Psychiatry Refresher Course. Dr. Mary collaborates extensively with various specialties, including family medicine, internal medicine, critical care, and OBGYN to enhance educational outcomes. Dr. Preisman's dedication extends beyond her clinical education roles. She is deeply invested in promoting work-life balance. This passion led her to develop and run a wellness series for ICU fellows, and her outpatient practices significantly focus on healthcare workers. Additionally, she manages the demands of a bustling household with 2 young children, embodying the work-life integration she advocates for. Mary, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's such a pleasure to have one of our favorite people join us today.
Well, thanks for having me. If that preamble didn't bore everyone, I hope that I live up to some of those accolades. Thanks for having me.
Oh my gosh, it's such a pleasure. I was like, wow, this is the most I've ever had to use medical terminology in my vocabulary in one go in my life. And as I was doing it, I was having a conversation with myself in probably like my second or third brain, being like, this is actually really hard to say out loud as I was saying it. You know, my mom.
We should all send our official professional bios around to our friends.
Yeah.
So that we can know each other that way.
I'm like, I had no idea. Well, it's so great to have you here today. And I know that we tried to do this before and we had some technical difficulties. So to see you here on the screen today makes us so happy. And for our audience here, we've known Dr. Mary, that's how we fondly refer to her as, for years and years. And we've become fast friends from the moment that we first met. And it's just so awesome to bring your expertise to this conversation today. And I know Ralph and I have been looking forward to it for weeks. So thank you so much for carving out time in your busy schedule to chat with us, Ralph and Kori, and let's just hop all into it. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what's inspired you to get into psychiatry to begin with.
Okay, well, that is kind of either a really long story or a really short story. The short story version is that I was looking for a way to get paid for talking to people.
Perfect.
Which is something that I really love. And this is a meaningful way to do that makes a contribution to society. So I get to spend my workday learning about people and kind of understanding how they think and how they behave. And I find that really rewarding. So other options included TV presenter or podcast host, but this seemed like more of a sure thing career-wise. So that's how I got it.
You'd be an awesome TV presenter, actually. I'd watch you.
Thank you. If this career doesn't work out, then you can write me a reference letter for that.
I would love to see you on the red carpet, actually, like for the Academy Awards. I think you would be amazing.
As the interviewer?
Yes.
Yeah, when they come down.
That would be awesome.
I think you'd be fantastic. And
I would be totally on board with that.
Well, Ralph, I'm going to toss this over to you to start diving into the topic today.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for that warm handoff, Kori. As always, much appreciated.
Always warm.
And yes, and now that I have the mic as well, I'd like to extend Dr. Mary. So awesome to finally have you here. And I think that sometimes when you have to wait for something that you want to happen, when it finally happens, it makes it that much more special. So glad to have you here. And really would like to know a little bit more about what you find. Like, I understand when you were explaining how you got into doing what you do, but what do you find really rewarding about working with people and being involved in psychiatry?
Well, I think it's really rewarding when people make meaningful changes in their lives in any capacity. And by the way, I love that you've taken on the intersection between mental health and real estate. I think that's really interesting. I love when two kind of seemingly unrelated things come together and then you learn that there's actually like a ton of overlap. So I love when I'm able to help make change either on a very small scale or on a larger scale,
Mhm.
and making connections with people and meeting people that you wouldn't otherwise in daily life, which I suppose is not that much different than kind of your experience of meeting different people and feeling quickly connected to them in kind of key vulnerable moments in their life.
Mm-hmm.
So that
100%.
probably resonates with you.
Oh, 1,000%. And it's one of the things that's so interesting is psychiatry and the personalized aspect of doing what we do. It's not anything that people think about when you think about becoming a real estate agent. It's nothing that they teach when you learn to become a real estate agent.
They
But all,
should.
but all of a sudden, it's 11 o'clock at night and you've got a couple and they're screaming at each other and they don't know what to do. Or it's 10 o'clock in the morning and you receive a call from one of your clients and they're crying. How do you help them make the best decision for themselves? And so having EQ is really important, but also developing a skill set so that you can help people go through the stress of making meaningful changes in their life that is in their best long-term interest, and working with them through it is such a huge component of doing what we do. I think there's a tremendous amount of intersection in terms of what we do that really isn't recognized versus what you do. And there's so much that we can learn from, I think, in this conversation that we thought it would be really interesting to have you on. And I think there's a lot of crossover
Yes, well, I
because you're
agree
dealing with
completely.
people under
You're
duress.
describing a kind of in the moment need to
Yes.
apply skills in couples and family therapy or de-escalation and distress management in your own work, where we're fortunate that we have formal training in those things. So if we're encountering people who are fighting or crying, we have some baseline skill set about what to do, which you also inspire me to consider that we should be teaching that
Yes.
to people in your industry. So happy to take that on if that becomes a
Uh,
side project in this conversation.
that would
But it is
be
an important skill set in those moments, right? And you're developing it over experience and time and mentorship with colleagues. And I mean, same here, right? We are not all kind of automatically equally skilled in those things, but they're super important things. It's kind of hard to know what to do when there's a ton of emotion in front of you with someone that you don't know well.
Totally.
1,000%. It's something that you're not trained for, but something you're thrust into because you're dealing with people's futures, their goals, their aspirations,
Their money.
their stress, their finances. So much gets tied up into it. And you're seeing people at their most stressed and sometimes at their worst. And how do you help guide them through it? And there is no training. Like there is nothing. There's not even a book. There's no support. Like there are so many levels. And I didn't really go into this conversation thinking about it. I knew that there was a connection and crossover, but I think there's a massive opportunity for training and for support for people in our industry in a professional manner, helping people, their clients, through really difficult, emotionally charged, challenging situations.
100%. When people come to see a psychiatrist, particularly when you know you're coming, so you're not coming through the emergency department, but rather you've made an appointment, you're coming to see a psychiatrist for an appointment, you have the sense that you're going to be talking about very personal things. There's going to be some aspect of kind of a deep dive with honesty into some of your issues. And I don't know that people expect that when they're meeting with you.
Not at
No,
all.
not always. And it's interesting because sometimes we're the first people to know things. Like we're sometimes the first people to know someone's getting pregnant or someone is pregnant, probably not getting, but probably is.
They're calling you as it's happening.
or divorces. Like we're usually called in before and aware of these big changes in people's life before their closest family and friends.
I'd say death in a family is another big one. And I also think that people don't even know who they're going to become until they're in the process. Because I think a lot of people have the sense that buying and selling real estate is super fun because they've watched way too much reality TV. And then they get into the process and they don't even know what they don't know how they're going to feel until it's high stakes, a lot of financial pressure, decision making, which is not everybody's strength, relationship issues with their partner who have two different ideas of what they may or may not want. And then things start to evolve and escalate over time. And these people who seemingly seem lovely, 2 months ago, turn into monsters 3 months later because they're so stressed. And so people often ask us,
So what do you do when people give you those bombshells of information? Like they are calling you when they're getting pregnant or they tell you these things about themselves. Like how do you
listen.
navigate that?
I think listening is probably the biggest strength that we both have when it comes to those situations. And certainly we don't step in and pretend to be therapists or psychiatrists in these moments, but I think letting people vent and get it off their chest and feel like they feel safe to tell us stuff and trust us to keep that intimate information private, I think is really important. So I'd say the first tool that we rely on is listening and just letting people go there. And I often think that after they just get it out and they've had somebody to chat with about it, they feel better already and come up often with the next action point that they need to make to move on in the process. That's how I'd answer it. Ralph, do you have a different point of view on that?
I think listening is number one. I think understanding the power of asking questions, specifically the power of open-ended questions, knowing that people generally can uncover within themselves what the right decision is if you ask the right questions. And so the power of listening combined with saying, well, I hear what you just said, but what do you really mean by that? Or do you think, this could be handled in a better way? And if so, what would you do? Like there are ways to ask questions, to dig deeper, to push people to think on a level that they don't want to go or haven't gone before. And so I think that in conjunction with deep listening is really, really important. And I think also when the time is right, just being able to share and be like, yeah, I understand, like compassion, like I've been through things that are similar. Here's how I dealt with it. Generally, after you do those three things, there's the energy sort of diffuses and you're in a bit more of a less emotionally charged conversation and it starts to become more productive. And I think those things are really, really important, but nothing you're prepared for, nothing that you're prepared for. And
Well,
I think
it's really nice to hear because it's a really thoughtful approach. And I also just realized that that's such a psychiatrist thing to do is now I've asked you questions that are open-ended about
yeah,
how you think about things. So I've become the question asker, which is for sure my comfort zone. So
yes.
it was not the agenda.
You threw it back, but it is interesting. And I did a coaching course in the middle of COVID because Kori and I were like, how do we professionally improve? Well, there's a slowdown, but the slowdown only happened for 2 weeks and then the market shot back up. And then we were in Harvard doing a master's certification course in negotiation, coaching courses. It was out of control.
That's when we started needing our own therapy at that point.
But it was interesting because I had to do in front of a large group of people a coaching call where I was the coach for a woman who was really stressed at her job. And she was the head of something very significant at Johns Hopkins University, like Johns Hopkins Hospital. And I'm like, oh my God. And I just learned by just having very calm energy and listening and talking and asking really good questions and causing them to think on levels that they haven't thought of before. And then being able to empathize with them, with my experiences, or just who I am as a person, it so is helpful moving somebody from a very high state of emotion into a state where they feel comfortable about talking about what really is the core of the issue and then moving forward from there.
What I find also interesting about this is oftentimes Ralph and I work with clients together, and one of us will just naturally become that couples. I'll use a couple because that seems to be sort of the traditional model, become that couple or that individual's lead. So they'll connect more with one of us than the other for whatever reason. And that's totally okay. And that's why I think it's great that we work together. And that bond will start to continue to assimilate over time. And so one of us will always be the lead on the emotional process of real estate, depending
That's
on
true.
who in the couple or the individual who they connect with. And there is no pattern. Like it's not always like the woman connects with me or the man connects with Ralph. It could be
Well, because everyone is different, right? In terms of how they form connections with other people and what they're looking for and the energy that makes them feel psychologically safe.
Yes.
So that matters less about your specific demographic, but just like what you need emotionally to feel okay.
Yeah, I find it so interesting. So that dynamic is something else that we're always dealing with. And we can intuitively figure out who the best person is to have hard conversations with or to pick up a phone late at night or to answer a a passive aggressive text message or whatever it might be, we can pretty well instinctively be over time.
Passive aggressive text messages.
So a lot of them. We could print out our text history on our phones, and that would just become a very juicy, interesting conversation within itself.
I did a teaching session once for my colleagues in the recovery room. And essentially the topic was what a psychiatrist would say. So people presented challenging things that were said to them. And then I would respond the way that, kind of based on training and experience, the way I would respond to it. And it was really interesting to see kind of the difference between how they responded, my proposed response. So someday, if you want to play that game,
yes,
that sounds like a fun party activity.
That'd be fun.
Great party activity.
That'd be fun. And it's and another thing that's interesting, I think, is more from the psychiatry side. Your communications are more formalized. I would generally think that people come and they book appointments with you and they meet with you and they have a schedule. Maybe there's some communication back and forth between appointments, but it's mostly locked in a room or on a call, focused communication. Because people don't pay us by the hour, we are expected to be responding to things all 24 hours a day. And so we really get these passive aggressive, stressed out, emotional coming at us all hours of the day, 11 o'clock at night, 2 a.m. We don't get time and a half for statutory. We don't book so people think that we're just accessible. And sometimes we are the low-lying fruit for them to express a lot of their emotions because of that. Because they're not, a lawyer, if you're paying $500 or $700 an hour to a lawyer, you're going to be very careful with the communication, especially after you get your first bill, right? After you get your first couple bills, you're like, okay, I understand how this works.
You get your first couple bills and realize you went into the wrong profession. You should probably do that.
Well, probably not. I don't think I would ever want to do that. But that's maybe for another podcast. But I do think it's really interesting where it's almost like people feel that they can dump on us whatever they're feeling emotionally because we're working with them and now we're connected with them. And it's a lot. It really is a lot to onboard being in this business when you're working with people through really stressful things, especially the last 2 years. Oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
I bet.
There's a question I really want to hear your answer to, because I feel like you're on the front lines of the city, almost the pulse of the city.
Especially at Mount Sinai. You're in the heartbeat of it all.
So, and this is something that we felt a shift in, but I'd really like to hear your opinion of how would you talk about or rate the current state of mental health in Toronto today, 2024, February
2024, poor.
Yeah.
The state of mental health is poor.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really complicated answer. I think that for people who don't have a formal diagnosis or who aren't kind of already identified as requiring psychiatric care, I think the world is really complicated. And there's a lot of factors that make it harder to be okay than previously. Certainly, I think there was a huge impact on healthcare accessibility to resources during COVID. So that made it harder for people who were already in need of resources. And then certainly COVID had such a huge impact on everybody. But overall, pandemic aside, I think that the demands of modern life are really high. And I think in order to be able to cope with them, people need a certain amount of resilience, which is hard to get in our society and with the way that we live. So those are huge generalizations, but I think that we are connected a lot of the time. You're describing that people reach out to you at all hours. I think that's the case in a lot of professions. I think since people have been working from home, there's a really blurred boundary between time at work and time kind of not attending to work-related things. So work infiltrated our homes. It's good because you can do meetings with no pants on. It's bad because when you have no pants on, people expect you to think about your professional obligations. So I like to make a real clear delineation between the pants and no pants states of being. But that's really hard, right? Maybe you're not wearing pants right now and you're still doing this podcast. So
you'll never know.
We'll never know, and I'll never ask.
You can only imagine.
Yeah. So I think that's really challenging, right? Because people feel like they're always sort of connected. I think relationships are really complicated because if you think about the way that people meet now, like people meet each other largely in kind of online settings and using things like apps, I think it's really hard to get to know people. That's very stressful. Meeting someone to have a relationship with is now choosing between like 1 million profiles on an app that are all kind of overwhelming and hard to distinguish between versus just meeting someone at your local community or from down the street. Raising kids is really difficult because there's screens, there's competition, there's just so much pressure on everybody. And we're spending a lot of time on social media with lots of dopamine hits, with comparing ourselves to people portraying their best self online. So I think all of that is really exhausting. We're spending less time outside. We're being less active. We are like not leading the lifestyles that I think are healthiest for humans. So we're doing all of that while we're constantly connected to obligations. So even just saying that, like I'm already exhausted saying this answer.
Me too.
Which sounds really bleak. Like I think there's, the complementary good things about how we live, but I think it's really hard. And so overall, the pressure on the average person, particularly in an urban place like Toronto, is really high, right? It's hard to afford things. It's hard to do things. It's hard to meet people. You live surrounded by millions of people, but you don't really know anyone.
Yeah, so true.
And seems and maybe feels like that has gotten worse by orders of magnitude in the last few years. Like it's not like I don't feel like it's been like a steady increase. I feel like it's palpable in a way that it wasn't 3-4 years ago. It's palpable walking from Bathurst and Bloor to Bathurst and Bloor and Avenue Road, just walking down the street.
Yeah, so I think like the pandemic, right, like did many things and it caused a lot of problems around like isolation and revealing people's like worst features and really amplifying them. But the other thing that it did is that it made us afraid of each other because there was this concern that anyone you encounter might be like the person that's going to infect you. I think this is a really hard thing to step away from. So there's already a ton of like social anxiety or worry about being judged by other people, how people will perceive you. I mean, now there was like a concrete worry that other people are literally going to kill you. So when you live in an urban setting, you're kind of like low grade worried that maybe that'll happen, but not in a serious way. And you feel, the place and you're safe and comfortable. And that introduced like an extra layer to us that's really hard to shake off. But I think it is real and worse over the last couple of years.
And I also, in orders of magnitude, have seen a huge polarization between different ideological ideas as to how society should be run. Like the idea of left and right, the idea of like Democrat and Republican. Like I listened to this really interesting interview where they had Ray Dalio, who's a hero, talking to Larry Summers, who's the former treasurer of the United States, former president of Harvard. And Larry Summers was saying in this interview is that it used to be in the United States, like 20 years ago, if you were Christian and you brought a Muslim home to your family, somebody that you're dating, that would be unacceptable. Today, that's unacceptable. But if you have a Democrat family, today it's acceptable. Thank you, Kori. But today, if you're a Democrat family and you brought a Trump supporter home, that would just be horrible. And so there's this like psychological, ideological divide that's getting wider and wider, that's like putting this moat between people where people don't feel comfortable with expressing ideas, or there's no more any conversations, just things are either right or wrong, black or white, doesn't matter. Dialogue has been taken out. It's really, I think, been...
I have a lot to say about this. I'll start. Yeah. And if we start getting into I'm saying things that are too controversial, you'll redirect me. But the first is that people need to feel a sense of affiliation and like they belong, right? Yeah. Like that's a natural part of the human condition, is that we all need to be part of something.
Mhm.
So it is harder in our modern culture to feel part of something because we don't have the same kinds of communities that we had before.
Yeah.
So it's not the same to be part of a Facebook group as it is to be part of your local
Church.
whatever circle, right? It's just 1 or 17 steps removed. So we don't feel as connected, but we need to. So in lieu of other things that gave us sources of connection, be it religious affiliation or clubs or teams, now we pick political ideologies, and that's something we can affiliate with.
Mhm.
Yeah. And
So
you can
that is
also
creating. Go ahead, Corey.
No, I was
Sorry.
going to say, and if you choose a political ideology as a way to affiliate or connect with people, you're not even connecting with them in person. You're sitting on some forum online and like having a debate with somebody else across the world, another troll that's on there having the conversation. You're not even having a live discussion about these topics. You're just venting on
Well,
somebody's
that's
YouTube
the other
channel.
thing. Like if we were actually debating together in person,
hmm
it would be a lot different than commenting back and forth on each other's posts, right? It's easy to be brave and assertive behind your computer screen where no
Yes.
one can see you. It's certainly more challenging to engage in lively back and forth debate in person or even like this, right? So I think that's a major factor in terms of people saying inflammatory things and further polarizing, because it's easier to do so when the platform that you're using for that is the internet or X or Twitter or whatever, right? Like people are out there saying polarized opinions, and that's okay because they're home with no pants on and no one can see them and there's kind of
Right.
no consequences.
Right.
So I think that's a major factor. And then the other thing is that there's a lot of both kind of anger that people feel and they need a way to express that. So finding easy, sort of low-hanging fruit ways to express it makes sense. And then because of the way that social media works and our current access to information works, we really only see things that we already agree with. It's very
Yes.
hard to find an educated, balanced opinion. Most of us are not looking for that. So again,
No.
we're staying away from like lively, educated debate and just looking at the scrolling, same thing that we already thought, confirming our previous beliefs. So that's a setup for polarization and anger and division between people.
That is
So
so
that's for sure.
true.
Yeah, no, it's
Oh my
interesting, and I
gosh.
when I listen to what you're saying, I hear connection as being a running theme, and even though we are theoretically more connected as a society because of the internet and our phones and everything else, we've really become completely disconnected. And that disconnection from others is essentially leading to disconnection from our true
Yes.
selves,
Yeah, like
which is,
what people really want, all human beings just want to feel secure.
yeah,
Like we will do anything to attain a sense of security. And that's a lot harder to do if you're living your life in a kind of metaverse sort of way,
yeah,
right? Like, how do you feel secure? So you feel it because you become part of a group that has like extreme opinions. So everyone applauds you for saying something. But ultimately, like people need people. They need to be together with someone. They need to feel included. They need to feel connected. Like, absolutely. That's the most important thing, right? Like, that's what makes us all fundamentally human.
And I think people are looking for that sense of connection, like you just mentioned, outside of themselves. So they're on their phones and they're trying to be like, this thing that I'm looking at Instagram is going to be the thing to find fulfillment in. This is the way I'm going to get my perfect body. This is how I'm going to find my partner. This is the perfect vacation that I will one day take. And everything is outside you with a division of a screen. And it just keeps, again, it disconnects you with other humans. And then, as Ralph mentioned as well, it keeps disconnecting you with your own sense of self because you're just constantly out here looking for answers, thinking the next thing that you're clicking is going to be where the resolve in. And it doesn't live out there. It lives here. And that sounds so cheesy, but it really does. It doesn't live
Well, it's
in,
really true. Like one of the fundamental tasks of adolescence, right? This is in like the theory of how we become who we are, is that you kind of have a sense of what's your identity, right? Like that's what we're all doing in adolescence and early adulthood is trying to figure out who we are. And we do that by having relationships with people and by navigating situations with our peers and mentors and things like that. So that's way harder than ever because we are tasking a generation to do that while they're also looking at TikToks, right? So there's like 10-year-olds who believe they need a skincare routine.
Unbelievable.
Or Osama bin Laden was really a good guy.
Right, exactly. Like any of those things are available out there. And this is like a vulnerable time in life. So in terms of like, why is mental health poor? Well, it starts at the beginning, right? Like I would love if basic principles around regulating your emotions, supporting other people, managing yourself when you feel badly were taught in school. Like that's an excellent public health initiative. And to some extent, I realize like that's starting to happen, but that would be really helpful to create the next generation of people who are resilient enough to manage through like different stressors.
And I feel like that is another problem. A massive problem is the word resiliency. I feel resiliency has been taken out of us, probably because we've become so fantastically wealthy so quickly relative to other countries and societies historically or even currently, that we have so much access and we are working so hard to take adversity out of our lives that it makes the cost of that is less resiliency.
100%. So the goal of kind of modern living is to be as comfortable as possible.
Yes.
Right? Like we want to be at the optimal temperature. We are always in air-conditioned or heated cars or offices or homes. We are always physically comfortable. We sit on chairs that have excellent padding. We wear shoes that have foam in them. Like we are always striving for optimal comfort. And as a result, we totally can't tolerate any kind of discomfort. Right. And it's interesting because I talk a lot to people who have like serious and chronic medical illnesses, and they're quite different because they are forced to tolerate discomfort. And so they learn like an extra level of resilience that most people don't need to have, right? Like we have food available all the time. We're never worried that we're going to run out of food because we can go to any grocery store, order Uber Eats or, right? Like everything's at our fingertips. Everything is so easy. So the idea of being uncomfortable, even for a short time, is really confusing. And I think it's actually really important. I'm just reading a book about that reminds us that the ability to be uncomfortable, even a little bit, is like a really important part of humanity also. So we're missing connection because we're not with people. And that we're so comfortable all the time that any amount of discomfort feels incredibly aversive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, like when I've really thought about like what leads to fulfillment is its growth. I don't think of it, and it is connection, and I get that, but I always think about it for me as being growth, personal growth, advancement, moving forward in things. If I don't feel that, and it kind of goes back to the adage, if you're not growing, you're dying. Because it's either one of the two. If you're not expanding, you're contracting. And just staying flat is really a form of contraction. And what's really interesting to me is that when you go to the gym, the way you build your muscle is by lifting weights until you can't. And then when you stop, that's when you've gone to your limit, and then your muscles repairs and grows. If you want to train to become really good at anything, you have to work your mind or your body in a way that pushes it to a place of discomfort to stimulate growth. If you want to build your inside spirituality, you have to sit in your own self in discomfort, or you have to have a conversation with a psychiatrist and put yourself in a position of discomfort to ask questions. So any real growth has to come from discomfort. And you can't grow without that level of discomfort. And in my opinion, you can't be fulfilled or really know yourself unless you're prepared to do that. And society is telling us to do something completely different.
I agree. And people also stop wanting to grow and develop as adults.
Yes.
Like
they're
there's
encouraged.
Kind of phenomenon where we expect that we are done. So we finish whatever we finish, we get some sort of career, and then that's it. We've ticked all the boxes and we're all done growing. Mm-hmm. And so that does a few things, like it makes us start contracting. And that's exactly as you described, like that leads to a sense of not being fulfilled and not having meaning, because you always need to be doing something or learning something. That's also part of the human condition. We need to do things. And because we're not doing basic things, like we don't cook food and repair our clothes and chop firewood and do things like that. We need
Go to the well.
Yeah,
Go to
exactly.
the well to get water.
And then we don't have to worry that that water is clean. So we're not working on that, but we need to be working on something, right? And we want our kids to grow and develop. So what do? We drive our kids to activities and then we sit there and watch them. And so what are we signaling to them? That when you're an adult, your life is over and you're in the role of sitting and watching. And the only way that you're expanding is physically in terms of your pant size, right? So I think it's really important to model to our kids that there is a purpose to becoming an adult, because otherwise, like, no wonder no one wants to grow up and wants to stay in a protracted sense of childhood and adolescence. If being an adult is boring and associated with no further growth or development, it is an aversive state to turn over into. So I think it's super important. Like, I like learning things with my kids. So I'm learning to ski and they're learning to ski. It's way easier for them because when they fall down, they just bounce back up. Whereas I needed to take a lesson where somebody taught me how to get back up. So I was just like lying helpless on the run. But still, right, it's important for them to see that I also learn things and do things and that we can do it together. Because absolutely, like, one of the ways to feel okay about your life is growth.
Yeah, for sure.
100%,
Ralph and I often
100%.
inform our decisions, but we're like, does this make us feel uncomfortable? And do we feel a little bit scared? And if we're like, yes to both of those questions, then it's probably something that we should do, not the other way around.
And look, I mean, I think on some level, you need to achieve, like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You need to achieve basic security, safety, have enough food to eat, clean water to drink. Like, you need the very basics to be at this place. And I'm going to make the assumption that most of the people listening to this are there. So the next level absolutely is to do something, right? Like, you cannot expect to feel okay all the time. And that's the other thing, right? We have this expectation we should be happy all the time. That's the state that we are aiming for. We need to take medication or do whatever possible to feel constantly happy. And that's not realistic. So a lot of times when I work with patients, we have a discussion about, like, what's actually a realistic outcome. And it is not to be happy 100% of the time.
No, not at all.
Well, you can't know happy if you don't know sadness. It's like the Eastern philosophical, without darkness, there's no light, right? Like,
exactly.
How can you know you're happy unless you know what sadness is, because you don't have a basis of comparison?
Yeah. And the thing is, like, people have a lot of questions. And, when I end up in social situations, like, people ask me if I think they have depression or anxiety or whatever, which is, why it's tempting to go to parties and just say you're a hand model or something. But,
same in real estate.
I bet they ask you what's the value of their house.
God.
So, all disorders are very, very extreme versions of things that are normal human experience, right? Like, everybody feels sad and everybody has times where things are really hard and where it's difficult to move forward. Everybody has times where they're really worried and they're anxious, right? Like, when you have a disorder is when it's either happening most of the time or it's interfering with your ability to function. Right. And that's when you should probably, like, talk to your own doctor and do something about that. But really, like, a lot of these things are happening to everyone all the time. And it is not realistic to feel perfectly happy and comfortable 100% of the time.
That's so true. I have a question about that. This might be a little bit of a sensitive way of asking the question, but mental health is such a huge, broad spectrum. And obviously, there's just so many different verticals of what that is and ways to define it. Do you feel from your position as a professional that mental health has become kind of trendy in a way, and that a lot of people are leveraging some of these low level feelings or a little bit of unhappiness or a little bit of anxiousness or worry or stress, and they're like, I don't want to feel these things. This must be mental health, and now I'm going to take 3 weeks off of work because my work will pay for, an emotional leave or whatever it is. Do you think people are kind of taking advantage of it, or do you see it as kind of becoming trendy, or is that an obnoxious question to ask?
I think it's a totally reasonable question to ask, because it's the kind of thing that people actually think but don't want to say. because there's so much of the like what's appropriate to say, not appropriate to say, which is another major driver of stress for people in our population, is like worrying about being like so appropriate that actually you're totally stuck. So I applaud this question.
Okay.
I would say overall, it's probably a good thing that mental health is trendy, because in a way, like I tell my colleagues, I would rather them send more patients, and some of them don't need to be seen, than miss the ones that do. Right. So in a way, I think it's better to see someone and say, like, actually, like, you're okay, than to not have seen the person who really needs help right now. So that's important.
Yes.
That said, in any system, there's always going to be the people who are using it in a way that's really beneficial and people who are not. And that applies to mental health and everything else. So absolutely, there are people who are making use of the fact that we're paying more attention to addressing mental health issues to like do things that are kind of self-serving. And I think that's actually not self-serving at all. It just seems that way in the moment. At the same time, it's probably good that people are made aware when they need to do something. But I also think we need to be really careful, right? Like, psychiatric disorders range from quite common to exceedingly rare. And it's also, like, people are really worried about whether their experience is normal or whether there's something wrong with them. Again, because like not being connected with other people, not having a sense of like what's kind of globally going on, drives us into an isolation of worrying about ourselves. So absolutely, I think more people are getting the help they need. I think more people are misusing the fact that mental health is more talked about. I think there's a lot of virtue signaling around mental health as well. That's not a popular term to say, but I think people will make mention of it or suggest that their organization is deeply committed to it, and then actually like not be doing anything about it other than saying it. So I think with anything that's generally good, there's the flip side that's probably less good. And overall, I'm glad that this is something that people are at least like thinking about.
Yes.
And I don't think everybody like needs to take time off. I think some people do, but it probably doesn't apply to everyone.
That's a great answer. And I think this also goes back to the theme of connection, is when people are experiencing emotions like stress or anxiety or late night worry or insomnia, because we're not connecting with people on a real level and having real conversations, and we're associating everybody to their Instagram profile, people aren't even having conversations with their own friends about what's actually happening in their lives. And I think if people were like, oh my God, it's not just me that is completely stressed out about this situation, or it's not just me that, sits up at night and worries that I'm not good enough, or whatever it might be. I think
we're all working so hard to put our best selves forward that we're missing opportunities to talk about like what's really going on, which is why by the time people see either me or you, they're in a real state of thinking like this is just them, they're totally alone, and everyone does this nicely. And I'm sure like this is me guessing, so you can correct me if it's wrong, but people are looking at social media posts of people buying their brand new house and looking really happy and everything is perfect. And when their process is complicated and time consuming and difficult back and forth, they think that they're doing something wrong.
Totally.
What's interesting, time back into the real estate part of this conversation, is we often see people sometimes, more so in relationships, but also just in people's day-to-day lives, where they think that the real estate part is the fix to their unhappiness or to their mental well-being. And so, and it goes back to what Kori was saying, is it really always comes from in here, but people, it's much easier to look out there. So it's like, my house is on the wrong side of the street, or it's dark, or my condo is in the wrong area, or whatever. And the solution is another property, or our relationship is failing, and so let's just go buy a house and that'll fix it. And
you can't run from your own thoughts.
No.
Right?
No, wherever you go, there you are.
Exactly. You will continue to have the same problem set and a better lit house on the right side of the street.
100%.
Right? So that is not the answer. I think like certainly there are times where people need to make a move and it makes sense. But if the reason for it is something you feel is missing within yourself, you're not going to find it in a move like that, right? And you're not going to find it in your first meeting with me either. Like it's going to take work and effort and addressing multiple things. Absolutely. There's a lot of seeking. We're seeking what's missing and we're seeking it in easy fix kind of ways. We'll do the next program, we'll buy the next property, we'll do that, and then we'll be happy.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, what's interesting as well is, are you seeing, and I'll explain, I guess I'll lead up to the reason why I'm asking this question, is we have seen a massive uptick in situations, real estate related, where lawyers are involved. And it's almost like prior to a couple of years ago, or even a year ago, we had very little direct communication with lawyers. We have multiple situations now where people are getting divorced and lawyers are involved. There has to be a shared email where everybody's CC'd on this email and on the communication, estate, people fighting over money. Like, I've never, since we've been doing this, seen so much stress and animosity between parties where lawyers are having to be involved and things are having to happen around real estate because emotions or finances are literally breaking down, and it's becoming commonplace. And it goes back obviously to, I think, people feeling really stressed and under duress. But are you seeing that as part of like what I'm describing to you with the breakdown of relationships or finances and real estate and lawyers and things manifesting outside of themselves to a lot of duress? Because we're caught up in a lot of that right now.
Yeah, so that sounds super stressful. And I think that, yes, you can send me your OHIP number at the end of this meeting. So it sounds super stressful.
Can you hook me up with something?
Yeah. And it's a reflection of how stressed people feel overall, right? And I think there's a few comments about that, is that certainly there was like a lot of exposing of relationships that weren't going well, particularly during the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
So that's led to probably this happening now because that was the preceding factor. So you're now seeing the consequences of that. The other thing is, when we don't know how to manage situations ourselves, we look to other sources. So this is kind of the same theme that we discussed before. Like, we don't know what to do, so we look to you or the lawyer or whoever to provide some kind of direction or stabilization. And instead, it sounds like it's making things worse and more stressful. So there's that, right? Like, it's a wish to have a fix, and the fix is going to be this like email that everyone is copied on, and there you go. Like, now the situation will be better. It sounds like it's worse. And then the other thing is, like, real estate is really expensive. So it's a big deal. You know, like, it's one thing to fight about your Beanie Baby collection and decide, like, guess what, we thought that'd be expensive, but it turns out not the case. So if that's the source of conflict, you know, divide them up by color and take half and you take the other half. But this is like one of those issues where it's the same thing as people's most vulnerable, like, finances and really big ticket items. And so when we're not sure what to do, we end up in these like paralyzing sort of lawyer involved, email heavy situations. It's not good for anyone.
And it's interesting because you're talking about Maslow's hierarchy. Well, what's one of the most important things on Maslow's hierarchy? Shelter, right? And so if you think about that related to housing affordability, how has that impacted mental health?
I think it's huge, right? I think the idea that it is attainable to work up to purchasing a home, that's no longer part of kind of the typical vision that somebody has for themselves with like a reasonable amount of education and sort of professional prospects. So that's really difficult. And there's a lot of sense of unfairness about that. Right? Because it was possible for people to move from another country, settle here, like work their way up to something that's like the Canadian American dream. And now that's really complicated and it's not as attainable. So people have had to completely reevaluate the way that they look at how they're going to live. And that's been a huge societal shift, right? And that's the case with everything. Like the price of groceries, the price of gas, the price of housing, everything is astronomically expensive. Incomes are not substantially higher. What you get out of your basic education is not substantially better. And so it's like a really stressful and daunting thing to be launching into the world, particularly if you think that your major tasks are going to be to drive your own kids to activities. Then you also can't really buy anything. So it's like a huge problem,
It's a
right? And
really
so
big
it
problem.
makes people feel really constrained because they are.
And I can see anger coming into it as well. Like, why does this person have this and we have the same education and I work harder than this person, but I can't have it because my parents weren't able to spot me a 20% down payment 20 years ago on a property or whatever it is, or 10
Yeah.
years
Yeah,
ago, or
there's a
5 years
real
ago, or today.
disparity
Like,
between what people have
yeah, of
access to. And we're already comparing ourselves, right? So we're
course.
looking at what everybody has because we have the information available to us. And then we also see that people have things that we are definitely not going to be able to attain. And that's also really hard for our self esteem, our sense of self, our sense of future.
Mhm.
So that's super challenging.
We see this a lot. We work downtown, we live downtown. Such a shift in homelessness. It's unbelievable, like how many people, like it's becoming like a bombed out US city here. Not quite, but you can see the trajectory that wasn't there 3 years ago. Like, how is homelessness playing into this, and how is that affecting what you're seeing at the hospital, in your practice, or in your conversations with
Well, I think
other?
it's huge, right? If people don't have the basic needs of food and shelter, the expectation that they will be able to be well is really unrealistic. So it has a major impact on healthcare resources. It has a major impact on availability of resources to support this population and others. And it kind of becomes like a healthcare crisis, but really it's an infrastructure and societal crisis. And so it's super multifactorial, right? The issue around homelessness isn't limited to there's not enough mental health resource or there's not enough funding for something. It's really complicated. If it wasn't, we would solve it. But absolutely, it has a major impact on every part of the system. And things have become so polarized that on one hand, we are looking at housing in the seven figures. And on the other hand, people are not able to find a spot for themselves in a shelter because there's not enough. There's like a huge divide,
Mhm.
uh, which again, like makes living in urban Toronto somewhat complicated.
So I have a question for you, and maybe after this question, I will give you my OHIP number. But I was very intrigued in your bio when Kori was talking about your involvement in work-life balance. First, I'd like to know about like what your involvement, like how you're working on that path, because how that ties into what you do, and maybe talking a little bit about it. And I'll be taking diligent notes on that.
So I think work life balance is a tossed around phrase
Yeah,
that has become trendy also. I also like the term work life integration in that it's very difficult to
better.
actually find that balance. There's going to be
Mhm.
times where work takes more and there's going to be times where life takes more, and so finding a place where those scales actually even out is probably unrealistic. So let's stick with work life integration. I think one of the key things around that is healthy boundary setting and prioritizing. So there's some things that just don't matter as much as we think they do. You know, like we all know about stories of colleagues who either move on or retire and they really put in so much work and effort, and then like no one really remembers them because everything moves forward, you
Yes.
know,
Yeah,
and there's like some legacy where a couple people remember them and then everything else just moves on, you know? And
yeah.
so keeping that in mind
Mhm.
allows you to make space for other things because our careers are not the only thing, right? We need to have our relationships, we need to have our own well-being because without that, there's kind of no point to anything else. So setting healthy boundaries is based on prioritizing what's important to you and then not letting other things interfere with that. So if there's
Um,
like a hard limit on one of your work days where you know for you to be well, you must attend your guitar lesson on Tuesdays at 6 o'clock, then you just don't book anything because you've declared that that is the most important thing to you. I periodically cancel my guitar lesson at 6 o'clock, but that's just because I'm prioritizing that. I don't feel like it. But I will say that identifying things that really matter to you and then truly making them a priority with boundaries that are firm is really important. And boundaries in all kinds of ways, not just with our workplace, but boundaries in our families and in our personal lives. Like people will take from you as much as you're willing to give. So
Mhm.
you have to decide how much you will be giving.
Mhm.
And you are people that if you let them, others will take as much as possible. You are
Mhm.
warm, you are welcoming, you are knowledgeable. And if you let it, like it will be a nonstop, as I'm sure you know, like influx of asks, demands, etc. So realizing when you need to set some kind of limit around that and not engage with it anymore. And it's totally okay to say no to things and people that don't serve you, right? So you don't have to be part of every committee. You don't have to join everything. You don't have to go to social plans. One of the best pieces of advice that someone gave me was if you're invited to something and you don't want to go, you don't have to make up an excuse. You just say, like, thanks for the invite. I can't make it.
Oh, I
And you don't have to
love
make
that.
something up. You don't have to lie about it. You don't have to remember what you said. You don't have to like come up. You just decline because you've declined.
That is
And you
really
don't
good
need to
advice.
explain yourself. Yeah, you don't have to explain yourself to anyone. You don't owe anyone anything. And so that's really empowering because you can start just declining things. And I teach a seminar for the residents in OBGYN. And I taught them, it's supposed to be about like wellness and resilience. One of the activities that we did was during the session, we all either took away or excused ourselves from or canceled or quit something that was no longer serving us. So we all took 15 minutes to cancel a meeting or stop paying for the yoga studio that you never go to, or just realize that you're never going to follow through on whatever that is like hanging over your head and just quit it. And it was like one of the best, most useful exercises because we're all in things that are taking up our time and bandwidth and that are like really not useful for anything. So there are committees that everyone was part of that they were just like putting on their resume. They weren't getting anything out of. And now you have a free hour. So you've been given the gift of time. So I think we can all cancel various things that we currently think are essential that we're not getting anything out of. And then we'll evaluate like in 3 months, if you really miss it and you cannot live without your whatever safety committee something, then great, you can rejoin it. And if paying for that yoga studio and not attending is like really actually what brings you happiness, like go ahead and send them more money. But I bet it'll be way better if you don't do it.
To add to that, it's really interesting because I was listening to this podcast and they were talking about how there was a 20-day challenge. Like that's a big thing. Everything's 20, 30. But one of them was you have to do something that will bring about rejection. So, and it would be a task. So like on one of the tasks where you had to go to Starbucks and ask them for a free coffee. Just go up and say, can you give it to me for free? Of course, they're going to say no. But then you see when they say no, nothing really bad happens. And so once you start to learn to say no or do things that are holding you back and you realize nothing bad has actually happened, it makes it easier to make those type of decisions or statements to protect your own boundaries over time. And I thought that was really interesting and tied into it. And I know we're starting to run short on time here. So there is one question that I just thought would be really great to throw to you while we're here as a wrap-up question. For people who are struggling with mental health issues, not the heavy issues, but just people day to day who might be feeling disconnected or might be feeling challenges with work-life integration, like what kind of advice would you have for people who are out there feeling just that kind of omnipotent sort of stressed all the time?
Yeah. So I think the basics really apply here.
Yeah.
Like for sure, if you think that you have something that is impairing your ability to function or that it's really debilitating, like that's a conversation with your doctor. But the step before that is to attend to eating, sleeping, physical activity, time outdoors, exposure to sunlight, connecting with people who matter. Those are the things that we can all be doing to bolster our emotional well-being. So eating nutritious food that's not processed, being physically active, spending time outside, being with people and animals who mean something to you.
Well,
Like, start with that. You know, we can't get to step like 25 if we haven't done steps 1 through 5.
Yes.
So those are things that a lot of people are not doing for themselves. And if the reason you're not doing it is because you're depressed and you need like clinical care, we'll provide it for you. But if the reason that you're not doing it is because it doesn't occur to you that you can't move forward in your life or you can't make meaningful changes if you are eating Pop-Tarts and sitting down, then you should try doing something about that, right? Like that's a real thing. And I talk to a lot of patients about lifestyle modifications and bolstering their chance at feeling well by doing all of these things, which are hard. They were, again, if they were less hard, more people would be doing them, but they are the foundations of living well and feeling well.
That's amazing advice, and I totally agree. You're just such a rock star, Mary. It's just so good to see you here.
We love you, Dr.
We could talk to you for like 5 hours about this. So interesting. And
I know this is super fun. I realized the time and I was like, oh, I guess we need to like continue doing things.
Okay, well, we'll wrap things up for today, but we'll definitely have to have you return for part number 2 because there's just so many things we definitely want to ask. But we're just so appreciative for you joining us on this super insightful episode where we discuss the complexities of mental health inside the big urban center like Toronto. Our discussion unveiled critical insights into how city life intersects with mental well-being. Armed with Dr. Mary Preisman's expertise, we hope to inspire informed conversations and practical actions in addressing these issues. Keep engaging, stay curious, and join us again as we explore more topics that impact our favorite city and its future. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Ralph, how would you like to close us off?
I'd like to tell everybody who's made it with us through this entire journey today to be sure to click that subscribe button, hit that like button. And if you have any constructive comments, we'd absolutely love to hear from you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dr. Mary.
Thank you.
It was a delight.